Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Leadership Loft. I am your host and moderator for today, Lakeisha C. Brooks, and I have yet another esteemed panelist and facilitator for this year's Diversity Blueprint virtual conference. If you haven't already, go ahead and get your tickets. They are free. It is a conference like none other. It is 100% case studies. So even though all of the panelists know the methodology around these things, they want to talk to you about the how and the results of the work that they've done. So without further ado, I will introduce my facilitator and speaker for today. Darrell, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
I am Dr. Darrell Burrell. I come at this work from a kind of an eclectic background. I've spent a lot of time in government, industry, and in academia. Education wise, I have a bachelor's, five master's degree, and three doctorates. But a lot of my work has been around equity and inclusion and how we make the workplace more dynamic and inclusion of the voices of people from diverse backgrounds, abilities, and perspectives.
Okay, I'm sorry. Did you say five master's degrees? I have two. Five? How did
Yeah,
you have the
five. I'm finishing up
time?
my sixth. I'm finishing up my sixth this month.
Okay, how did you find the time to get not one, not two, as LeBron would say, three, four, five, and then you say you have a number of doctorates? Before we dive into these questions, I want to know, how did you find time to do all this, and what are these master's and doctorate degrees in?
So I work as a professor and researcher now. I'm probably one of the most unlikely people you'll ever meet that's educated because I was not a great high school student. I grew up in one of those households where my dad is do as I say and not as I do.
Mm.
So I grew up in one of those households where you might have had a little PTSD around report card time. And I actually was not mature or ready or had the abilities to go to college when it was time to go. I went to schools that were open admissions. My high school graduating class had 468 graduates. I think my class rank was 302.
Wow.
I didn't really understand the value of education until I went out there as a person of color and tried to compete and realized without my education, I couldn't compete. So I met a professor that made me fall in love with learning, who believed in me and told me what I couldn't do when a lot of people around me were telling me what I couldn't. And then I just, once I finished my bachelor's, I tell people my bachelor's was the most significant because it opened the floodgates for me to believe I could do the rest.
Right.
And then from there, I've just been a lifelong learner. Everything that I've studied has all been connected. And really, not to offend people in any way, I'm a person of faith. And what I really realized was my education is not about, ooh, wow, look at me with all these degrees. My education is really, how can I use it to serve and help other people? And so I pursued education in that way. But what I later found out about 4 years ago was part of the reason why I probably was not a good student was I had undiagnosed learning disabilities.
Wow.
And the problem was in certain households, we're not testing you for that. We just see that you're smart. And we're like, you're just not trying. Right. And so, you know, I didn't figure out till later in life when I figured out my own coping mechanisms. But I guess I share that story to be an advocate of, parents, if your kids are struggling, you might want to see, is it dyslexia? Is it ADHD? What is the dynamic? And, I think we need to avoid some of the stigmas around it because a lot of people don't want to know. But I feel like if you got cancer, don't say, hey, don't test me. It'll go away. Right. We've got to kind of figure out what it is and give people the support they need. So I just share that as a long roundabout way to say, that's kind of how I got what I got. Now, my degrees, I have human resource management, I have a master's in marketing, I have a master's in management and healthcare leadership, education. I have one in religious studies, interfaith action, and conflict management. And then I'm finishing up one in artificial intelligence. I'm looking at artificial intelligence applications around healthcare and equity and how we include diverse voices. I have a doctorate in health education and environmental health. I also did executive leadership coaching as a concentration. So on my transcripts, I have 12 doctoral credit hours in leadership coaching. And then I have a PhD in cybersecurity leadership. I did my research on workforce development. Like currently in the United States, we have like 1.5 million shortage of cyber workers. What my research argues is you're not going to fill that gap unless you start including women and people of color. I've been a big advocate that we should pay more attention to women's colleges and historically Black colleges as ways to tap in and kind of serve this market. And then my final doctorate, I did a doctor in business administration. I did things on public health, supply chain, and equity. And when we plan for emergencies, how do we include diverse communities so we never have a Hurricane Katrina again, where we're giving evacuation plans and perspectives on public radio when different communities may not listen to talk radio to get their information. So it's a long story, but that's kind of my journey.
Wow. And when we talk about diversity, the diversity of your education and your experience is plentiful and so many great nuggets that you share with us. So, one of the things that I heard a lot about is, again, the different organizations, the different education. So, you've seen a lot of different cultures within organization as well. So, before we dive into some of our specific questions about organizational culture, can you explain to us what is your definition of organizational culture? And how does that fit into a diversity architecture framework, for example?
So organizational culture really encompasses the written and unwritten rules in organizations, right? They're the values, they're the behaviors. One of the ways that I really became to understand this was when I finished my bachelor's degree, we had to do a research project where we had to do a presentation on a different aspect of organizational culture. And at that time, I actually did research and found out that Ford had bought Mazda, that was a Japanese company.
Right.
And they tried to use American values without really understanding the Japanese culture. And it was a disaster because we live in an individualist culture. So if I say, my work schedule is 3:30, I give you deuces and I bounce at 3:30, right? Whereas in Japan, they all collectively decide when we're going to leave and we all leave together as a group. And so there's some different cultural dynamics. Like in Japan, chances are your boss might introduce you to your marriage partner, right? And so there are all these different dynamics. So they work all day and then they socialize with clients all throughout the night. So, and from a business standpoint, if I've been doing business with your family for years and years, then I'm going to respect that relationship. Where in American values, I'm going to go out and seek other people to see if I can get a better price and leverage that price against your price. Well, in their culture, it's disrespectful because we've been doing business for the years and years. Out of respect, you're already giving me the best price. I don't have to leverage or negotiate or do some other things. And so, some dynamics around that help me realize that organizational cultures are different. Another example I'll try to use is years ago, I worked for a healthcare company. I won't say the name, but I was the only Black manager in the sales and marketing department they'd ever had in the history of that company the company's been around since 1935. There was one African American VP, and I was fortunate that one of my employees knew him, so he became my mentor. And when I first got there, for the first 2 weeks, a lot of people kept coming to my office saying hi, and they were all the Black people that worked there. And I said, why do these people keep coming to my office? And the woman's like, you're the first Black sales manager we've ever had. Like, technically, you're like the white tiger at the zoo, right? Everyone, everyone wants to see it. And so one of the things I learned about organizational culture was I was a parent, I had an infant, I just moved, I had my first house, all these different dynamics. And I went to lunch with my mentor, and my mentor was like, how much did you contribute to the CEO's political action committee? Because the CEO sent out a form asking managers to contribute some of their pay to political action committee. I said, I contribute none. I got an infant, I got a mortgage, I didn't pay anything. And he said, I'm going to have my secretary fax the form to your office and you
Oh.
need to fill it out and send it. I said, why? He said, the CEO, when it comes time for promotions and bonuses, looks to
Mm.
see what managers have contributed. He said, even if it's $10 a pay period, you need to contribute. So I use that as an example to say organizational culture, that's an unwritten rule.
Right.
And so a lot of times, if you're, a person of color, you're the only one and you don't really have people that are like you to tell you these unwritten rules. You stumble into them, and some of them could be, oh, I got a paper cut. Some of them could be, oh, I'm paralyzed, right? Because I've stepped on a landmine, I've hurt myself, but I didn't even know there was a landmine there. So organizational culture really broaches on a lot of those different dynamics that are written and unwritten.
Right. So, how would that relate to the diversity architecture framework, in your opinion?
So one of the things I think is important is I just got an article accepted I wrote on this concept called diversity dishonesty. And
Congratulations.
my, and my whole premise of it to try to explain it to you is, after George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, a lot of organizations put these things on their website and said, we're all about diversity, but really their actions didn't match, or
Right.
they didn't provide the resources to really be committed to it. So, I always say that the diversity is like a marriage, right? You got to go to marriage counseling, you got to be committed, you got to have those values there, right? You got to be respectful to it. And I think, when you look at an organizational culture, it has to have all those elements of that marriage. Otherwise, it's a hollow environment. Like I wrote another article probably about a year ago, and told my story about being the only African American male faculty member at a university, very, very elite, and I equated it to being Jackie Robinson in baseball, where Jackie Robinson was on the team, but he wasn't really on the team, right? You
Mm.
know, he's wearing the same jersey as his colleagues, but his colleagues are othering him. They put him in an outside group. And to bring that back to culture, the organizational culture said we respect diversity. Okay, you let me in, but when you let me in, you didn't treat me in a way that was hospitable and kind and inclusive. There's a diversity expert. Her name is Vernee Myers, and many people have probably heard me talk about her before. She
Yeah, I
says
know her name.
diversity
Yeah.
is being invited to the party, right? Inclusion is being asked to dance. So if you invite me to a party, but you never pay attention to me the whole time at the party, right? I'm not being included. I'm being invited, but I'm not included. So
Right. Yeah, Renee did a lot of work with a previous employer that I had, and she and I are connected on LinkedIn. She does a fantastic work. Yeah, I definitely heard a lot of great things there, talking about the employee experience, right? And that's every single everyday aspect of what happens for you as an employee. So if your employee experience is I don't feel like I'm along, or my employee experience is that I feel like an outsider, is that really contributing to productivity? Is that really contributing to somebody staying there a long time? So that's definitely what I'm hearing you say as well. And I love the example that you were given about merging organizations in different cultures. I, like you, study this stuff as well in my master's degree. And Disney was the same way. And Disney did and had an amusement park in Paris. And of course, culture in France is different than culture here in the US. So those are really good examples that you gave as well. So we heard a lot of great examples from you, but how does an organization assess their culture? What are some things that they can do to see, hey, our culture is great, or maybe our culture needs a little bit of help? What are some tips that you can give leaders to assess where they are on a cultural spectrum?
so one way you can do is a climate survey. I'm a big advocate of you really do it. If you want employees to trust it, you probably want to have an external organization do it in terms of somebody internal. Um, one of the things I did in the federal government is we did focus groups. We did this concept
Mhm.
called behavior matters. So the whole premise of behavior matters was we had these values on our website, but we went to employees and did a series of focus groups to say, okay, we got these values, but what does this value mean in terms of behavior and how you treat me?
Yes.
And then after we did the focus group results, we debriefed organizational leadership. Another way you can do it is you can do exit interviews. One of the challenge that I forgot to mention when it comes to climate surveys is, you have to be careful too how you do it, right? So I'm a big advocate, and some people are not, but I'm a big advocate of you do climate surveys to specific groups. So if it was me, I would do a climate survey just to women. I would do a climate survey just to African Americans, because here's a problem. If we did a climate survey and it's 100 employees and it's 7 Black employees, and we get the results back and it says 93% says we're doing great, right? Those numbers can be misleading as to what those results are, because all the African American people say it's horrible, but all the other people, which are the majority, say it's fantastic. And so even when you use instruments like that, you have to be kind of helpful and cautious and concerned. And then the other thing is, I think you do team interventions. Like I mentioned, once we did an escape room project, and that intervention allowed us to record and debrief, because sometimes when you see interactions and see how things, you can determine some subtle things as to what the culture is like.
Yeah, I love that you said that because that's one of the things that we do at Brooks Consultants is the intersectionality of that data. So I'm glad to hear another expert in the field talk about that because to your point, like we may do a belonging survey, but we always say, hey, for this group overall, yes, it was great. But if you look at these different, let's say 5 different subgroups, the numbers change. If you've ever looked at a scorecard that I've created with the International Coaching Federation, you'll see that as well. Some of those numbers change when you look at different demographics as well. So I'm so glad that you highlighted that because to your point, I think a lot of organizations may want to hide behind the smoke and mirrors of, oh, overall is great, but what about the other demographics within the organization? And you also talked about exit interviews. How do you feel about stay interviews and how they can contribute to a healthy culture within an organization?
Well, I think stay interviews are helpful as long as the culture, it has to be the right culture, because, you know, there are a lot of organizations always have this saying, right? Everyone doesn't want to put the mirror up to their face and see how ugly they look, right? A lot of times people like, tell me what it is, but don't tell me if it's that bad, right? Or it's this dynamic that you want to know, but you really don't want to know. And
Right.
so we live in an environment right now where people are very cautious about being honest and being truthful, because sometimes those things can be punitive. And regardless to what your management culture is, if I'm saying something to you, you might take it personal as a manager, as an indictment towards you, and you might not have anything to do with it. And so it's weird now. We live in an environment at work and outside of work where people are in tribes and it's tribal behavior. And so a lot of times, having these real and frank conversations are challenging. So stay interviews are difficult, where you really have to develop a level of trust to let employees feel comfortable to know that you're going to do something with this information, and not something against me, something about it within the organization. So those are very delicate. You have to deal with them in a very careful and respectful and concerned manner.
No, I love that you said that because it does start with trust and psychological safety. So, what can some managers or organizations do to be able to build that trust and psychological safety to do them? Because state interviews can be very effective, as you mentioned. And if you have a trust or psychological safety concern, you can't do them. So, what are some methods that organizations can do to overcome that?
Well, I think the main thing you have to do is don't just talk about what you're going to do, show it in actions and demonstrate it. One of the things that I've done in organizations before to really promote diversity is we've had diversity awards, and we've had senior leaders as diversity champions, where they've picked an idea about diversity and they've led that activity. Real organizations are really putting diversity as a component in a performance evaluation where you're ranked on it. One of the programs I started was one called People to Watch, where I found an organization that could put our logo in a watch, and we had people recognize people that were doing great things in diversity. We sent them a nice certificate, and we sent them a watch, and we acknowledge them as someone to watch in the
That's
organization. So
cute.
I think you can do things that are acknowledge and recognize diversity for what it is. I worked at a university before where we did not have a lot of people of color in management roles. And one of the things that we did was we instituted a diversity advocate in all our hiring. And what this was an external person that when the search committee was deciding who we want to interview and developing interview questions, they were in the interview process along the way. And they were there to kind of coach people as to this could be a bias, right? This is a question you shouldn't ask. Well, why are you picking interviewing this person versus that person? And then afterwards, that person would do a debrief report with senior management as to how the search went and different dynamics around the search. If you look at some of the conflicts we've had in organizations around affirmative action and do we need it and do we not, I think part of the problem is we've never really done a good job of explaining why affirmative action and diversity is important. And then we've let a narrative get out there that says the premise of affirmative action is you take an unqualified person and put them in a role. The premise of affirmative action was qualified people were not getting opportunities. So all affirmative action said was you've got to interview qualified people. Now, where people resisted it was they either decided, I'm going to get someone who's incompetent and put them up there to make them a laughing stock to show that it doesn't work, or I'm just going to be lazy. I'm not going to spend the effort to go out and make sure qualified people interview. I'm just going to get the first Black person or first woman I can find and interview them to say, okay, I checked the box, I did it. And so when you have measures where you're, okay, this is what we believe in our values, but this is what we do, I think that's really how you build that trust in organizations.
Yeah, and hearing you share that story about affirmative action and maybe just picking a token person of color to interview sounds a lot like the criticism that the Rooney Rule is getting in the NFL, where there are, excuse me, qualified persons of color for front office and coaching positions, but they're not necessarily getting that opportunity. They're just getting an interview, but are they really getting a fair chance, an equitable chance at getting the job? Or are they just at the interview because based on the Rooney Rule, they have to be there? So that's what I heard when you were sharing that story as well. So thank you for that. I want to shift gears and talk about wellness and culture. We're hearing a lot about mental health, financial health. Of course, physical health and benefits and things like that have been part of organizational culture for a while. How do organizations make sure that these 7 areas of wellness are inserted in part of their culture? Because it's more than just, I feel great, I love this job, I have a great employee experience. It's also about wellness. How can that be a part of the makeup of organizational culture?
Well, I think you have to be innovative. So I work at a university that is a Catholic institution, but they have a prayer room for people of different faiths. And so that's an aspect of wellness
It is.
that, can I pray? Can I, you know, engage my faith during the time at work, or do I only have to leave and do that? So when I did my research on interfaith action and conflict management, I really looked at religious intolerance in the workplace and these different dynamics and how we don't include religion when we train managers or when we talk about inclusive behavior. So it kind of stemmed that I had a colleague that worked at the Department of Homeland Security, and he said, if my colleagues find out I'm Muslim, it's going to sabotage my career. And he had to go to work hiding the fact that he was Muslim every day. And so I always remember that because I became curious to kind of research how that works. And, you know, if you go to EEOC, like Muslim Americans, and I'm Christian, so it's not my issue, it's not personal, it's just I've met people, but Muslim Americans represent 3% of the US population, but 25% of the religious discrimination complaints, right? And so if you look at an EEOC, we could file a religious discrimination complaint. And we have all this training in the work on diversity, ethnicity, sexual harassment, gender orientation, whatever, but we've never trained people, sexual orientation, but we never trained people on religions. And so that's an aspect of it. I worked at an organization once before where we had a health center on site, but that health center also had a counseling center. So if you knew at work during lunch, you could go make a therapist appointment or you could go get your flu shot, or you could go get a checkup. Those are some different dynamics that exist.
Mhm.
I worked at an organization at a daycare on site. So parents could have lunch with their kids by going downstairs. And those are different aspects of wellness that we don't really talk about in terms of diversity and inclusion. Where I've also worked at a place where, okay, I was a father. The my wife used to travel. She was not in the country. So I was the caregiver. She was in a van pool at a car. So whenever my son got sick, I was the person that came and got my son. But I had managers, one being a female with no kids, said, "Can't your wife get your son?" Right. So to me, and it was a weird dynamic to be at the pediatrician and be there with all these women and be the only male there. But those were just some dynamics around diversity, inclusion, and wellness, was to be able to say, I can take care of my child. And it was very, very important to me because my dad worked hard, my mom worked hard, but my mom was at everything. My dad was hardly at anything. And so I made a conscious life decision that I wanted to be available and around, when it came time for my kids to have activities. And that was a workplace value that was important to me, and I wanted an organization that respected that I had a family or life outside and allowed me that flexibility to do that, because then I could bring my whole self back to work and
Yes.
really work hard and contribute.
I love that, and I love the examples you've given. I mean, you said there was a clinic and all that on site, and wow. I mean, I worked at Reebok and well, Adidas brand, and they had a CrossFit gym. Now, I will tell you, when I went to Boston, that was amazing that you could just go in the middle of the day and go work out. They also had summer Fridays. So on Fridays, you got up at 1 o'clock, also a part of wellness. But what I really love about what you shared is the religion side of it, because for a lot of people, that's part of their mental health. That's part of who they are and their complete wellness. My dad's a very religious person, and God is number one in his life. And that's part of who he is. Like you said, coming as your whole self. So I think when you talked about religion and being part of wellness, I think a lot of people probably are going to listen to this and are going to be like, wow, I never thought about that. And your mention that that is an area of the diversity dimensions of personality and characteristics that's sometimes overlooked in the workplace. And I don't know about you, but it could be because those are one of those areas that you're supposed to not talk about. And your experience, why is that a topic, religion, that's not really covered a lot in the workplace, not covered in trainings, not one of those, like you said, race, gender identity, sexual orientation that we learn about as managers and leaders, and whether it's about educating ourselves on it or educating ourselves on being more tolerant and things like that. Why is religion, in your opinion, not one of those areas?
Well, there's different dynamics. So one of the things that was fascinating when I pursued my master's degree was I had a woman in my class, in my cohort, that worked for the largest atheist organization in the country. So a lot of people don't know this. Pew Research did a survey. I think they found that 30% of Americans are what they call nuns. Nuns meaning they don't believe in any form of religion at all. And so that's a perspective. One of the concepts I talked about was this whole concept called Christian privilege. Like, I'm not, and it's a real thing where we could say
Oh,
Merry
yeah,
Christmas and we
yeah.
celebrate Christmas. But if you have another religion, we don't really talk about it, right? If you're wearing a headscarf at work, people might look at you funny. Or if you're wearing a Jewish yarmulke, people might look at you a certain way. And so there are these different dynamics. And when I did my research, I did a lot of presentations in my thesis on religious intolerance in the workplace. And I was a global peacemaker fellow, meaning as a fellow, you're doing something on research on a global standpoint. And what's interesting was I finished that program in 2016, and there was a colleague that, believe it or not, did Israel and Palestine back then, but
Wow.
carried it from the 70s and 80s that it's been a conflict for many, many, many years. And so a lot of my peers were doing these big global things, but I was just like, okay, we can talk about global, but how are we ready to talk about global when we can't even talk about local things? Like when I come to work, how am I treated? Forget these global conflicts. What about these daily interactions where someone looks at me a certain way because I want a certain holiday off that might not be a holiday that you celebrate? And one of the things I use as a visual to kind of have this discussion is I show a Muslim woman with a headscarf and I said, what is the concern about headscarves? And then the next picture, I show a nun with a headscarf and say, we don't care about this headscarf. And then, of course, I show the most famous headscarf of all, which is a veil or wedding headscarf that a woman wears when she gets married. So I said, so why is it that we're afraid of one headscarf, but we're not afraid of another? Right. And to me, I use it as a visual way to help people really think about broaden your horizons around things. And then the training I do around that is um, I've told people to either reflect on when they went to a church or a religious ceremony that was different than your own, and what did you see that was similar to your own religion, but what did you see that was different? What values did you see from that? And so a lot of times people have had that experience where they went to someone else's church. Usually it tends to be around a wedding, a funeral, right? Or something of that nature where you get an experience to interact with someone's culture. And what unanimously people tend to find is that probably 80% of the same values in your religion exist in that other one. And you're not as far different as what you think. I had a beautiful experience 2 summers ago of one of my good friends. He's Jewish, and he married a female who was Indian, so they had a dual wedding together, and it was a fascinating but beautiful thing. But the thing I got out of both diverse religions is respect for family and respect for how we, have fellowship and community together and family. And I think that's the reason why it worked, and it was still a beautiful thing, even though there were diverse backgrounds and religions there.
Wow, I love that. And again, even for me, just hearing this and eye-opening to hear about religion and how it does fit into the workplace. And even though it is traditionally a topic that's we're not supposed to talk about, you're shedding light on the beauty of uncovering how important this can be because it is part of the everyday journey. Like you said, it's part of the employee experience for a lot of people. So how can we neglect something that is so important to our employees and taking days off as well? So before we conclude, I would love for you to share with everyone just a little bit about your case study. Don't go into too much detail because we want them to register for the conference and hear you. But can you give everybody maybe like a 90-second overview of the case study that you're going to share with them at the conference in August?
So essentially, what we did was we had a team that was dysfunctional and not working together. And so what we did was we brought them to an escape room and we let them interact with each other and we videotaped it and debriefed. And people were able to see some of their bad behaviors. But people were also able to see some good behaviors. And a lot of times when you see your interactions, it opens your eyes. But a lot of times when you interact with people, it also, opens your heart. There's this
Mm.
whole concept that Fareed Zakaria, who's CNN a lot, says it's hard to hate up close. And he talks about if I'm distant from you, I don't have no interaction with you, it's easy for me to other you, right? But if I interact with you and I have a personal connection with you because I know your family, I know things about you that are personal, then now you're part of my community. And so a lot of times in diversity, we look at people as different and distant and so odd and weird. But then when we engage in them, we realize there are a lot more like us, and our fears and
Yes.
our apprehensions were very unfounded. And so the whole interaction with the escape room allows diverse people with diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives to work together and engage people in an activity for an hour and get to know each other and build bridges and break down barriers.
Love it. Love it. And so, my last question is what is a fun fact about you that maybe most people don't know?
So I love fishing, freshwater fishing. I so my dad grew up very, very poor. So one of the things he made point was he wanted me to experience things he never experienced. So my dad always lived vicariously through me, where I didn't grow up with a lot of material things. My family was not very wealthy. Matter of fact, I consider my family and our neighborhood and community lower middle class. And we did the bootstrapping that a lot of African American families had to do to become middle class, where we lived off my dad's salary and we had to save my mom to work. And that's how we were able to buy our first home. And realized then in the era of redlining and banking, my parents had to put 25% down to even buy a house. And so when we lived out in the community, one of the things that was important was my dad sent me to summer camp out in the community and I learned about fishing. My dad was not an outdoorsman. He only went with me one time fishing, I think, but I learned to go on my own. And so I'd always been fascinated with freshwater fishing. I find saltwater, but I get a little seasick. So boats are not my thing. So literally, I was researching buying land. I wanted to build my own pond on that land. And I watched
Oh,
hours of YouTube videos on it. And I lucked out like right before the pandemic. I found a family that was selling this land. And there's a great site. There's a site called Land Flip and Farm Flip where you can just see land that's no house built on it. And I said, I want a property. I want to build maybe a modular home or something on it, and I thought I wouldn't have to build my own, but I found a piece of property that was 5 acres and had a pond already on it.
wow.
And so I was able to get an amazing deal for it. And then um, we had an excavator come clear part of the land. There was a dilapidated dock, the pond dam. There was full grown trees growing out of the dam, so you have to pull those out because the roots will seek water and tear it down. So this is how faith works in mysterious ways. The guy that came, the excavator, I looked and he was a fisherman. He had a Bassmaster hat on. And so he did all these little neat things to fix my pond. Like when they chopped down some trees, he dropped some logs in the pond as habitat. And then I ended up finding a guy who has a hatchery in Inwood, West Virginia called Zed's. And he actually stocked my pond. And he said, if you're not going to be there every day, you need to create an ecosystem. So he put my pond's a quarter of an acre. It's about 12 feet deep. He put
Wow.
100 channel catfish, 80 yellow perch, 20 largemouth bass, 400 sunfish that were babies. And then he put, for the ecosystem, 1,000 bullfrog tadpoles, 300 crayfish, 800 freshwater clams and snails. And we spent 3 hours unloading the truck and putting them in the truck. And then that was about 20 months ago. And then periodically, while I was teaching in North Carolina, it's in Virginia near the North Carolina line in the area called Clarksville, which is a beautiful unknown part of Virginia. If anyone gets a chance, Google Clarksville, Virginia, and you'll see how beautiful it is. And so I, I periodically went down there once a week to check on the fish. And we laugh in my house, but my favorite store is the Tractor Supply store because you get these big 5-pound bags of mealworms that usually people on the farm feed chickens, but the hatchery guy said throw the worms in the water to see how healthy your fish are. And my therapeutic thing was to go there, feed my fish, pray a little bit, be thankful for being fortunate. And so slowly but surely it's coming along. And now finally we're at the stage where now in the next 60 days the house will be finished. And
Wow.
so that's kind of my hobby thing is
That's
fishing. So
yeah, that sounds amazing. I just decided to get a garden outside of my backyard. So that's I'm not to pond yet and all of that. So step one, get a garden. That's where I
so
am.
my son is in the garden. He's actually doing his PhD in agricultural leadership.
Wow.
So at Virginia Tech, he fell into it. He just took up gardening as a mindfulness activity
Mhm.
and just fell in love with it. And then I have relatives that are Choctaw Indian from Mississippi and Black. And what he started to realize is at Virginia Tech, the Monacan Indians in Virginia have a land acknowledgement. There's a land acknowledgement thing with them in Virginia Tech, and he started interacting with the tribes, and he learned how people in different tribes grew certain foods, prepared them. And so he went there as a master's student doing art. He fell in love with gardening, and he changed his project from an animation
Wow.
project to going to the native tribe, getting their seeds that are only germane of their tribe, harvesting it. He actually made the bowls that they eat the food out, got the recipes from the tribe, and basically grew the food, cooked it, and shared it with people. And basically said, if we think of our culture and communities and our family, how we cook food, prepare food, and enjoy food as a family is an art form. So if you think of,
Wow.
you know, recipes that your grandma or your mom had made, and you think about Thanksgiving or you think about holidays where everyone brings certain food to the house, he talked about that being that sense of culture and community being an art form. And that was
Wow.
his thesis project. And one of the professors in the agriculture leadership saw him and said, I need you in my PhD program. And so his friends used to tease him that he was driving he had a Chevy Cobalt 2010. They would tease him because he had mulch in the trunk. And so when he got in and he got accepted a program as a gift, I bought him a used pickup truck and surprised him, to help him support him with his dream of what he wants to do. And so he's been developing community gardens for African American churches, and he got a grant that created a fellowship between Virginia Tech and Virginia State, which is the HBCU he went to as an undergrad, where they took a dilapidated piece of land at Virginia State and he turned it into a community garden where the agriculture students could get experience, not just learn in the classroom, but get experience. And so, you might say it's a little garden, I'm just doing a little garden thing, but my son started out the same way. So there's no telling of where it can go or what practice it can serve for you for your health and mental well-being. So just a thought.
Love it. And I love how you tied all of this together, what we were talking about. He didn't mean to do it. He's just that good, y'all, that he can tie all these things together. I want to thank you so much, Darrell. I am so excited for you to join us for this conference. I'm so excited for you to share all these nuggets and wisdom about culture and wellness and how they all fit together. Thank you all for listening to us talk about wellness and culture. And if you haven't already, please register for the conference. It's the Diversity Blueprint, Building the Blueprint for Diversity Architecture. Again, I am your host, Lakeisha C. Brooks, Diversity Architect. Until next time, see ya.